The question of who gets to write the canon is, in my opinion, on par with asking who watches the Watchers. For the last 200 years, each successive generation of musician has gotten to put their own spin on who they deem to be important. In the realm of rock, the answer is almost always in this order: the Beatles, Stones, or Led Zeppelin, with some fluidity on those other two. In the rap canon, these days it seems to be Biggie, Tupac, and NWA, with a lot of fluidity. Or if you're talking to the older generation, you'd get the inclusion of Grandmaster Flash and Run DMC. In Western art music, however, the three Bs have pretty much had a tyrannical hold on the canon, the top list in the canon. And those three Bs, of course, being Brahms, Beethoven, and Bach. Not in that order. Normally Bach, Beethoven, and Brahms.
Yes.
This had been the standard really since the latter half of the 19th century, when the canon was truly solidified. Regardless of which generation is writing these decisions, though, the list of all-time greats is always held up as the gold standard for writing, composition, and originality. But who gets to be in charge of those decisions? In centuries past, artists, musicians, and critics got to decide who'd be included on the list based on whatever musical aesthetic they determined was important at the time. During the early 19th century, as the canon was kind of forming, the idea was whose music was most eloquent. By the late 19th century, it had become whose was most emotional. Then politics got involved in the 20th century.
It's always a bad idea.
It is always a horrible idea.
It's always a bad idea.
And by no means is this an inclusive list, but the big ones that jumped out at me as I was writing this is Germany during the 1930s, when all Jews were expelled from the canon and public performance. In the Soviet Union, it was anyone whose music reeked too much of capitalism. And in America, the canon was expanded upon to include first women and ethnic minorities during the 20th century, and the last 20 years or so it's been included, or expanded rather, to include gender identity and preference, sexual preference. So all this begs the question, who makes these decisions? This week on In Time, a Music History podcast, we are examining the various criteria and reasoning behind who gets to be included on this fabled list of all-time greatest musicians, and why I believe that we shouldn't so hastily be discarding anyone that has come before us within the confines of our education system. I'm your host, Zachary Singer.
And I'm Susan Zeringer.
Welcome. We have two quick things before we begin. First, while we're preparing our next season, which is going to launch in September, we wanted some input from you. We've got a lot of things coming up, but we really would like to know what kind of show you would like. We've got a lot of our walkthroughs for periods coming up, which is how we're going to start our next season. But I wanted to ask you... Music periods, not the punctuation. That would be so boring.
Yes, that is the confusion.
Anyway, if you think that we could do anything to help you contextualize what's going on beyond just how we've been handling the show in the last year, send us a message at intimepod.com or at intimepod@gmail.com, where we'll get back to you and hopefully give you the product that you deserve.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Also, if you're watching this on YouTube rather than listening to it on your favorite podcatcher, leave us a comment. Tell us what you think.
Like, comment, and subscribe. Yeah. Hit that like button. It's like right here.
Right. Pure criticism is less helpful than reasons why. If you have a request, we'd love to hear it. If you think we're doing a particularly good job with something, we'd love to hear it. And if you think we could do better at something, we'd love to hear it. Don't just leave us a comment that says, you guys suck. That's not helpful criticism. But if you have, you guys suck, you're very bad at this particular thing, that's like not great phrasing, but useful feedback. So Let us know.
And also, head on over to intimepod.com where you'll find show notes for this and every program. But also there's a donate feature that we've set up. Please consider donating to this show so we can improve our infrastructure. So that way you can get the programming quality that you deserve. Because as much as I like talking to a computer camera, it'd be nice if we had some more stuff and lights that didn't cast this giant shadow behind me.
You don't
Anyway.
want to do the shadow boxing thing? We could make shadow puppets. I can't because they're behind me, but
Anyway.
you could make shadow puppets.
All right.
This is the content you asked for.
Yep.
It's not
This
the
is
content
exactly
you asked
what
for.
people
No
asked
one has
for.
asked us for anything. Please ask us for something.
So, anyway, welcome to In Time, a music history podcast.
You signed up for this.
We like to pretend as musicians that the canon of Western music is kind of like unchangeable and set in stone. And
For clarity, we are in fact not talking about canons, the musical device wherein one phrase is repeated at different times by different parts.
Yeah, that's pretty set
But
in
we are
stone.
talking about canon as in what is the story, the overarching story, and the important facts.
the important touchstones of
the
Western culture.
Touchstones, that is the word that I was looking for. Yeah. Mhm.
Now, of course, there's also the literary canon. Nowadays, the film canon, the the theater canon. We are specifically talking about the music canon today.
This is a music fan cast.
As I've already stated, this list is an ever-changing one. But in order to be included on this list, there are some general guidelines, normally speaking. You ready?
I'm ready. Let's go.
1, you have to be dead.
Not what I was expecting, but not untrue.
2, you have to have a wide range of both living and posthumous influence. And 3, you have to stand out from the vast majority of your contemporaries in some way, shape, or form. Now, I know some of you watching this at home are pumping the brakes hardcore saying, no, Zach, you're wrong. You have to be a dead white male.
That's just a I can't even say that with a straight face if I'm being satirical.
So here's the thing. This is primarily a music history show. I'm not interested in rewriting the canon here today, although we are going to discuss some about how that changes or how those things come in. There are numerous historical, cultural, and political factors that play into who has been considered important. It is not my job to critique the people that have come before me in this regard.
No, and we cannot change history. We cannot change who people have said was important up to this point. What we maybe can do is recognize previously unknown to us and to the wider populace. I don't remember how I started that sentence. We can change who is recognized by us and by the wider populace who may have been previously unknown. And we can attempt to recognize people based solely on their musical merit in the future. We cannot change that maybe there was a contemporary of Beethoven's who was a woman of color who has no historical recognition and no memory in history because we don't have a time machine.
Yeah. If you disagree with us and what we've said here, by all means, send us an email at intimepod@gmail.com. And as long as we feel that you're coming at us in good faith, we will gladly speak with you. Because this is a continual discussion. One that, quite frankly, as I mentioned in our last episode, keeps the music alive.
Also, if you know of any composers, musicians, contributors to the canon of Western music, because again, this podcast is really more or less about Western music because that is what we know. If you know any contributors to Western music canon that we have not mentioned, have glossed over, that you think are important, particularly if they are anyone who is not a dead white man, let us know. I'd love to hear about them.
Before we get into this, we know that Clara Schumann existed.
Oh, yeah.
And
Clara
Fanny
Schumann,
Mendelssohn.
Fanny Mendelssohn, and also, I mean, this is a little outside our current purview, but... what's her, Fanny Crosby? Is that her name? Who wrote like hundreds of hymns in the second half of the 1800s?
I'm not familiar with her. Mostly because I don't work in hymny. Anyway, though.
That's fair. That is really more my purview. But yeah, there have been, Fanny Crosby. There have been a number of notable female composers and writers. IMHO, none of them have really gotten the recognition that they deserved. But again, I cannot change history, and it is not my job to rewrite history.
So, to prove some of our point here that this canon is still a fluid creation, let's look at the entire catalog of the man who is considered to be the greatest composer of all time, J.S. Bach.
You may notice that this podcast is not 12 hours long. And that's because when we say, let's look at the entire catalog, it's going to be an overview.
Yeah, very much so. But so for Bach, during his time period, music was a tool. You were essentially functioning as a musical craftsman whenever you created a piece of work. And because of that, you would get numerous things created for the same holiday every year, which is why you get numerous passions for Easter, numerous oratorios for Christmas, or various points of the year, because the demand was on new. It isn't until the 19th century when we start valuing older music as being relevant to the current story. Until Beethoven, your role as a musician 9 times out of 10 was as a court composer, meaning you worked for some duke, duchess, or king or queen, and they paid you to create music on the regular. You are, during this period of time, a musical craftsman. As the 19th century wore on, though, people began to see worth in older work, and thus the formation of the canon began. While we're speaking about Bach, it's worth noting that had the canon been a thing when he was alive, he would not have been included on it.
No.
He was better known as a teacher and organist than as a composer, because the style of the time had already moved past the way that he was writing. That's why we use Bach as the summation of the Baroque period, because he takes everyone's ideas that existed before him, forms them into one glorious product and purpose, and then we've moved on.
Well, not to mention that he was not seeking popularity as a composer. That was not one of his goals in life. He was a composer because he was an organist, he was a violinist, he was a choir master, and he was a church musician, which is also why he signed all of his music with the SDG rather than his actual name.
Mm-hmm. Now, the title of greatest of all time would be bestowed upon him only because of Felix Mendelssohn, who rediscovered his St. Matthew Passion.
Fanboy number one, Felix Mendelssohn.
Now, I shouldn't say rediscovered because Bach's music never went anywhere.
Sure.
It was deeply loved by a very hardcore group of followers for, I believe, about 70 years or so.
Yeah, and was perpetuated within the church for all of that time.
Especially the church in Leipzig, where he lived for 30 years.
Yes.
It took Mendelssohn rewriting the St. Matthew's Passion and putting it on for a public performance for people to really realize what Bach was up to long after his death. Although his sons, in numerous cases, were still active composers and still relatively popular for their time period. Likewise, if we look at another person who's considered to be the greatest of all time, Mozart, because if Bach is the music of God, Mozart is the music of heaven, I believe is the analogy used.
And Mozart would he did want fame, and he would have described himself as the greatest of all time.
This is true, as would Beethoven. But the thing is, Mozart, during his lifetime, until the Magic Flute comes out in the last couple months of his life, was widely regarded as a disappointment. Because he was a child prodigy who had done great things as a young boy, being taken on tour by his father and performing with his sister, Nanel. I can never remember how to say her name properly.
Yeah,
it's not written in front of me.
Give me 10 seconds to Google.
It's okay. Until the Magic Flute, he was just kind of doing his own thing, and then he died. So he didn't get the chance to become widely popular. So this begs the question, why do you have to die to be canonized? Ordinarily speaking, the living don't get added to this list of all-time greats because it is the same reason why you don't become canonized as a saint in the Catholic Church until you've been dead for a while.
Her given name was Marianne Anna Mozart. Her nickname was Nannerl, which really needs to be spoken with a German accent to be appropriately appreciated.
That's fair.
Nannerl.
Fair. If you're alive, it's very easy to write you off as a trend. Even if you're immensely popular and very quickly recognized to be immensely influential. However, and let's be real here, there are plenty of composers who were popular during their lifetime, immensely popular. I have a cat in my lap. This is Dahlia. She likes trees and snuggles. Anyway,
she is the
for those of you watching the video. Otherwise, the rest of you will just have to recognize there's a cat here. Go away.
Aw, rude.
Come back. Anyway. The real thing is, though, your influence has to be felt by at least one successive generation of musician, if not 2 or 3, for your worth to truly be recognized. And this kind of falls into the generational trend that we discussed over the course of our last season. Because the first generation of people, the first really influential people, are never recognized the way they should be during their lifetime.
Sure. I feel like there are also, I feel like it's worth mentioning that there are probably a couple of different things going on there, because you can kind of, in pop music particularly, you can kind of see that changing a little bit, because many of the musicians who are considered really formative and really important are in fact still alive, but their heyday was maybe 50 years ago at this point. But I think it's worth mentioning that in the time period of Bach, Beethoven, Mozart, Brahms, that was in the days, the communications in those days moved much more slowly and was much less pervasive. And so
also your lifespan was shorter.
On average, yeah.
And Handel.
That's a whole other thing.
Bach and Handel were not young men when they passed.
No, but it might take 20 years for a popular composer's music to move from Paris to Berlin, or Austria is a more apt analogy, because Vienna is where so many of those very popular musicians were. But it might take a very substantial amount of time just for anyone who didn't live in the same city as you to get to know your music. Like, that level of fame moved much more slowly. These days, if a very popular musician puts out a song that people like, it's on Spotify within 24 hours, and literally anyone who has internet access in the world can listen to it.
Mm-hmm. And there's also something about timing that needs to be said here, because Beethoven is, for all intents and purposes, the first addition to the musical canon. And that's because he arrives at a time not only when they're starting to look backwards and recognize the value of music, not only because he was immensely popular and had just recently passed when Mendelssohn put on the St. Matthew's Passion, but because he is the first composer to break with the old tradition of being simply a craftsman. Mozart had tried. He had succeeded to a varying degree at the end of his life, but Beethoven is the first person who, during his prime, demands to sit next to the king. During the course of his lifetime, the analogy is he went from sitting at the servants' table to sitting with the royalty, and that is 100% true, partially because of the force of his personality and the demands that he had that he be taken seriously for his art. His break from the system of patronage, which had lasted for 800 years, was such a radical departure that it is only possible because of the sheer personality force that he had, his ego, drive, and, quite frankly, arrogance. But when you're that good...
Right. They say you better be good to be that much of an asshole, and he was.
This brings us to another key component of being canonicized. You have to be well-liked by at least one generation of musicians who are working within your genre, as well as the general populace. Now, that being said, there are plenty of people who are canonized in various forms of music that aren't necessarily meeting both those criteria, but we're going to talk about that in a moment.
Right. I would say for this conversation, I think it's a lot less important that you personally are liked and more important that your music is liked, because in fact, there are so many musicians, artists, craftspeople, actors who are famous for being terrible people who produced shockingly good art.
Right. Like the dichotomy, or it is not as clean as we would like it for you to be well-liked as a person and well-liked as an artist, as we are going to touch on here also.
Right. It would be so nice historically for good artists to be good people.
Right.
And yet...
I mean, for their time, they might have been. Like, that's the thing. Our societal standards always changing causes a problem in terms of whatever you're looking at, which is also what I was getting at last week on the show with not tearing down what's come before you. Because in 50 years, I love you to death. You're a wonderful person, Susan. 50 years from now, there might be something about you that we all just want to piss on. It's like, that way she's wearing her lipstick. Doesn't you know that... animals were tested on that? She's a horrible person. Like,
they weren't. My lipstick is cruelty free. All my makeup is cruelty free.
You just had to step on my analogy there.
Yeah.
Okay. Anyway, you eat meat
because the point is my point is that like there are lots of things that we recognized 50 years ago were terrible, but just like nobody said anything because we were just like, that's just how it is. It's nobody likes it, but that's just how it is. This is a whole other thing.
Right.
Thing.
There's also something to be said for the fact that what one generation detests or what one generation tolerates, the next generation will actively embrace, which is a completely different discussion.
Yeah. Whole
especially when
thing.
we're talking about fads and trends in terms of appearance. Like,
right, but there's
anyway,
okay.
we're
totally different podcast.
So
there's a real big difference between
on
fads and social values and morals. Different things.
So to go for an example of someone who was not well liked during his lifetime and music was not appreciated, we've got a twin spear. One of them is our good friend Gustav Mahler, and the other is his contemporary Anton Bruckner. Mm-hmm. Both of these individuals were active in writing during the same period, but during their lifetimes themselves, they played second fiddle to a guy named Max Reger. Have you heard of him?
Nope.
Exactly.
No idea.
That's my point. People fall in and out of favor, and in terms of Mahler, it took the generation of musicians after the generation of musicians that worked with him. So, for example... Mahler becomes popular in the 1960s because of Leonard Bernstein, who is the director of the New York Philharmonic, who heard the music of the future in Mahler. He's he knew World War I was coming before he died. We've talked about that on the show before. However, the generation of musicians that Mahler was presiding over when he was himself the conductor of the New York Philharmonic 50 years earlier hated him because he was a tyrant. It took a generation being removed from that emotional connection to Mahler for them to appreciate his music. But during their lifetime, Mahler's music was not popular either in Vienna, where he came, or in America, where he settled for 2 years, because it was viewed as being neurotic. And neurotics were not appreciated by society at large at the time. Anton Bruckner was considered to be a fool. And that's because at the time, in order to be a musical genius... you had to essentially model yourself after Beethoven or Wagner.
Sure.
And for those of you who are not familiar with those models, they were full of themselves.
Yes.
Very much so. And
egomaniacs. Definitely, both of them.
Bruckner was incredibly humble. That didn't play well in the 19th century. However, in the case of Mahler, as I've already mentioned, his rise comes during the Cold War. For Bruckner, he actually becomes incredibly popular in Nazi Germany.
Huh.
But, unlike Wagner, he doesn't get labeled as a Nazi composer.
Well, was Bruckner a Nazi sympathizer? Because Wagner was.
Wagner was long dead by that point in time, as was Bruckner, I believe.
Oh, okay. Fair enough.
So, there's just some weirdness as to who actually gets included and as to who gets placed where in the canon, and there are just some things we can't account for. So
sure, and that's just in the case of an artist who is no longer alive, that's just an odd and unfortunate coincidence as far as what demographic of people decide that they love your art and why.
Which brings us to the question, who decides what's canonical? Because, yes, the expansion of the canon brings all sorts of voices to the surface, but it also brings some contention.
Oh, always, yeah.
So, in my ideal world, the canon would be written by artists and musicians who are basing their decisions solely off of musical merit. I'm not concerned so much as who you are as a person, as long as you are writing quality music that can clearly stand up against anything else. Now, that's not saying that, anything written today can't stand up against Bach. They're completely different worlds. Like, you have to keep some level of perspective involved there.
I agree insofar as once you are gone, once you have died, your art can be judged completely on its own merit. I have a problem with rewarding people who are terrible people. I have a problem with ignoring people's terrible behavior in order to... That's a different neither
discussion.
here nor there. I do agree that when we are deciding who should be remembered as an artist, it should be based on whose art is good. I think also, I don't know, I have this image of like a board of musicians who are making the Musicians Hall of Fame or whatever. But that's the thing, like a lot of people
think that exists. A lot of people think that that's how it works, and it's not.
It's not, but it is. I mean, it's sort of by popular opinion because it matters who writes the textbooks and who does the things, and in a sense, it functions more as a popularity contest than as an actual measure of quality, because there are, I'm sure, very high quality musicians whose work has just never seen the light of day.
Right.
But how are we the populace supposed to know whether or not their art is quality if we cannot find it? I have a great love for the band Wax Fang, and they put out 2 albums ever, and they had like 8 songs each on them. Nobody knows about Wax Fang, and that's like reasonable.
So that actually brings us to the conundrum of who gets included on this, because not everyone who is influential is popular. Not everyone who is popular is influential.
Oh, yeah.
There is a gentleman named Captain Beefheart. Great name.
Great name.
Great name. And he absolutely falls under your conundrum of horrible person, great musician, because he was this is not accounting against him, but his behavior here is definitely wrong. He is a paranoid schizophrenic who literally abused his band members to get the music that he wanted.
Ooh.
Like, he put if I remember correctly, there's a story of him putting one of his band members in a barrel and beating the barrel just to psychologically break him down to get what he wanted. But the thing is, he gets immensely influential in the last 25-ish or so years, because when the last gasp of rock and roll was going through in the early 90s or late 90s and early 2000s, that like New York-based indie rock, Strokes, Kills, White Stripes. I realize that the Kills and the White Stripes are not New York-based, but he played an immense role in shaping their musical identities.
Sure.
And Jack White is a much more palatable figure than Captain Beefheart. Alison Mosshart is a much more palatable figure than Captain Beefheart, but they were both greatly influenced by what he did. So by that sheer recognition alone, he gets placed somewhere in the list of all-time greats, even if he is just towards the bottom, because he is what I'm going to refer to as the composer's composer. And that is a tier that we don't really talk about, because they aren't immensely influential to begin with. So take someone like Jeff Beck, for example. He is a well-known guitar player. But if you asked, and this is getting really esoteric here, if you asked who were the guitar players to come out of the Yardbirds, if you know who the Yardbirds are.
If you've been listening to this podcast since the beginning, you know who the Yardbirds are.
But Eric Clapton would be mentioned, and Jimmy Page would be mentioned.
Yeah.
Jeff Beck, because he kind of goes off and does his own thing, musically speaking, doesn't get included as highly on those lists. Sure. But if you ask a guitar player, hey, who's one of the greatest of all time, Jeff Beck is definitely towards the top of that list. And that's where things get a little messy in terms of who gets included in the canon, because there are plenty of people who, at the time, might not have been the most popular, but they go on to influence someone who is immensely popular.
Sure. And I mean, and you also kind of perpetually have that problem of like, okay, again, who are you talking to? Because there's the microcosm, you know, there's the who is immensely popular and influential with the world at large or with musicians at large. But then everybody has their own niche. Guitar players know guitar players. Pianists know pianists. Trumpeters know trumpeters. And you, like, there's no particular reason for your favorite saxophonist to be really widely influential.
I don't know. Kenny G just speaks my soul song.
Kenny G is not your favorite saxophonist. Do not lie to me.
I know that's true. But then also it comes down to, and this is the difference between composers and what they write. Mm-hmm. Because if we're looking at the work specifically, there are some pieces that just take a long time to get into the lexicon because their music is just incredibly difficult.
Sure.
There is a trend in music that each successive generation's virtuoso has to be better than the last, which has over time caused tiers of difficulty to really become a thing within your general populace of playing.
Sure. So and I assume when you say difficulty, you both mean difficulty of learning and performing, but also difficult, like how palatable it is to mainstream.
Exactly. Yeah. Because let's take the late Beethoven string quartets or Waldstein or the Hammerklavier.
I love the Waldstein.
Oh, I love Waldstein too.
God, I love the Waldstein
but
so much.
At the time, basically only Beethoven could play those things.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
But 50 years later, they are able to be played by a particularly gifted musician. And now you don't even necessarily have to be that, especially if you're looking at like the later works of Mozart. You don't have to be a world-class musician to play through his later works.
Sure. And I mean, to be fair, that is just sort of a general trend for humanity. You see that same kind of thing. I mean, like the knowledge, the coursework and knowledge that you come out of that high school graduates of the class of 2020 are coming out with is roughly equivalent to someone with a bachelor's degree in general studies from 100 years ago. It may be substantially more from 100 years ago.
There are certain things that got dropped. There are certain things that have been re-emphasized in a different way.
No, but I'm like particularly thinking about like the levels of math and science that you do as high school coursework now.
Absolutely.
General, pre-calculus is not something that any high school student would have gotten 50, 75, 100 years ago,
Exactly.
I don't think.
And so a lot of that does play down to just what does your society value at that time. So the question is here, what are we looking at when we're talking about the canon? What are we actually discussing? Because there are several different tiers, as we've already discussed. But who decides where you get placed on that tier is completely dependent on who is the loudest voice in the room, really.
Oh, yeah.
And speaking in musical circles, there are some exceptions, of course. Bach is only considered to be the greatest of all time, not just because he summarized the last 250 years of music history at his point in time, but also because of who he went on to influence.
Yes.
Mozart learned from Bach's music. In fact, I believe he took several lessons with one of his sons, which one was the London Bach, J.C. Beethoven studied his fugues, and his life ambition as soon as he discovered Bach was to write a fugue as good as Bach's. He never really accomplished it. Oh, he got close, but he also had to make things harder for himself.
Fugues are a lot more difficult to write than you might expect.
Yeah, I tried. It does not sound good. Anyway, now, without the influence of the people that came after Beethoven, so Mendelssohn, Bach, Mozart, Chopin, his music probably would still reside somewhere in the niche of deeply loved by a certain group of people, but not accepted by the general populace for whatever reason.
Sure.
And, of course, all of this is sidestepping the issue that I pointed out at the beginning of our show today, which is the political rewriting of the canon. So, by and large, there are a couple of things that can cause you to be written out of the canon. The least controversial is your music just falls out of favor.
Sure.
We like Max Rieger. We can hear it and think, oh yeah, that's music. It's good.
That's a very good example of what was going on at the time. It doesn't move me.
Yeah. And that happens, and we kind of have to just accept that, maybe this person was really famous at one point in time, but now we've moved on. The problem here is when politics get involved. And this is where the contention of who gets to write the canon is really being discussed in our modern discourse, because our modern movement to be more inclusive towards certain voices has really kind of been ham-fisted. If in my opinion, we've been rather ham-fisted about certain things, because the way we go about determining who should be removed from the canon is political rather than musical.
Well, there is a long-standing tradition of attempting to force people who disagree with you to be forgotten.
Yeah.
There's a very long-standing tradition. And whether it is, Russian czars of the early 1900s making sure that anyone who's a particularly capitalist composer does not make its way into Russia, or...
Wouldn't have been the czar, but I gotcha.
Well...
I gotcha.
Or people who are just terrible people getting forgotten because people don't believe they deserve recognition.
Right, which brings us to the elephant in the room here. As always, Richard Wagner. Because...
Man, what a terrible person he was.
I mean, he was, let's be real, but his contributions to music are so great that you cannot escape him. Especially in the world of opera, which he literally took, reinvigorated, and we now think of opera, what we're thinking about is Wagner. Yeah. We're not thinking about the magic flute unless, you like the magic flute.
Yeah, anyone who is never gone to the opera, never seen an opera, never sought out an opera, when you think of opera, you are thinking of Wagner. You're
thinking of large women with helmets, with horns on them, the Valkyries.
That's Wagner.
Yeah.
That's not opera, that's Wagner.
However, we have to acknowledge that Wagner was a ardent German nationalist in an era before Germany was unified, and also a vehement anti-Semite because that was in the water at the time. And it was only going to get worse from there. And where he really comes into contention is when the Nazis decide to make him essentially their state composer, despite the fact he'd been dead for a good 50 years at that point in time.
It's hard to write new music if you've been dead for 50 years.
What? Oh. So what have they been doing with Jimi Hendrix's library then? I kid. Jimi Hendrix, I'm looking at you. Stop digging up stuff that had no business being released. He didn't want it out there. Anyway. Yeah. So, in our modern day, there is a massive cultural push to expand who should and should not be included in the canon based on our favorite acronym, diversity, inclusion, and equity, and also decolonization. The way I see this, though, is that these are political decisions being added into a musical sphere. And in my humble opinion here, keep your politics out of music.
Okay, I'm going to disagree very slightly, and here's why. I do not think that we should be intentionally forgetting all of the dead white men of music, but I do think, especially in recent history, there are people who deserve recognition who are not getting recognition, who should be brought into daylight. And when you boil it down to the most simplified reasons, the reasons that some people who should be getting recognition are not getting recognition is because they are not rich white men.
Well, I mean, rich is a general term here. So
Zach,
I got you.
90% of the U.S. is rich in global terms. That's not
100% is of the U.S. is rich in global terms. We are the top 1%. Even our anyway. So
I am not arguing.
I understand, and I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm
almost everyone is not arguing for ejecting the rich white men from the canon and being like, you don't deserve to be here, get out of here. That's not actually what people are arguing.
Right. However, that's not the way that the activists in the music community, and there are plenty, are handling it. A lot of the, especially whenever we're talking about decolonizing the canon, I feel that we have to be very careful whenever we're throwing these terms around or we're throwing these ideas around, because it is too easy for an uneducated person to tear something down rather than just saying, I would rather focus over here. Because at the end of the day, you are the person that gets to write your own personal canon. Yes, there is a wider discussion around who should be included to the mass Western canon itself. But at the end of the day, you have the power to say, you know, this music of this person over here, it just isn't for me. And if we were to approach the question of who gets to be canonicized or who gets to be weighted as being important from that position, rather than just writing off anyone for any number of reasons, our discussion around this topic would be much healthier and be able to include many more people, because you aren't turning them off based on your opinion of how their opinion is wrong.
Right. I do absolutely agree that it is the current like societal trend for our culture to demonize anyone who has a different opinion than you. And I think we need to get over that.
Yeah.
That is not the way to live. Like, that is just not the way to be.
It is not. And that, my friends, is an exit. This has been In Time, a music history podcast. If you like what you've heard today, be sure to hit that like and subscribe button on your podcasting service or on YouTube. Also, share these shows with your friends. Like, comment, and subscribe. Find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, all at InTimePod. And head over to intimepod.com, where you'll find detailed show notes for this and every program that we do here on the show.
And when he says detailed show notes, Zach puts a lot of effort into making these show notes actually. It's not just a big list of links for where we found our sources. There's a lot of great information in our show notes. If you've listened to this episode and thought, man, I really wish they went into more detail about this thing, he probably did in the show notes. Go check him out.
I mean, I've been a little lazy this summer, let's be honest, but I have other things going on in my life right now.
What?
I know, having an infant daughter. Anyway.
4 weeks now? Is she 4 weeks now?
She is a month last Tuesday. This past Tuesday.
Ooh,
anyway.
Almost 5 weeks. Anyway.
Actually, 5 weeks today.
Is it? Oh,
Yeah, because today's...
the 14th, yeah.
Yep. Anyway.
Anyway.
We do ask while you're at intimepod.com that if we provided you with any sort of value, please give us a donation. You can make a one-time donation of $1, $5, $10, or $20 to the show, and all of that money will go to improving our infrastructure so that we can bring you the quality show that you deserve. This isn't about me getting more money in my bank account to go buy a car.
No.
This is about giving you, our audience, something of value.
Yeah, we have a long list of hardware upgrades that we would really like to make, and we cannot afford to make them if we do not have any donations.
Yep. Lastly, if you'd like to talk to us about anything we've discussed today on the show, send us an email at intimepod@gmail.com. Until next week, I'm Zachary Singer.
I'm Susan Zeringer.
Remember to stay in time, and we will see you in our next season. Woo!
Yay, next season.